Visualization architect at Perkins Coie. We are a multinational law firm with many clients and many lawyers. We have well over 1,000 lawyers who work for the firm. We range from England, I think, I'm not sure all the countries we're in. We're largely U.S. based, but we also have, England, and I think we had an office in China at one point. I don't know if we still do. And what I want to talk to you today is first a little bit about myself, and then I want to talk to you about how we're using Presto at Perkins Coie to kind of give you an idea that, Presto is great with the open source and all the talk that goes on about things like PrestoCon, where you're talking about all the great things that Presto is capable of doing, but kind of want to give you an idea that it has a practical application, and it means something to those of us who are using it. Though I don't contribute directly to Presto, I'm a user, a consumer of it, and I want to give you an idea that all the work you're putting into it is beneficial to those of us on the other end of that. So I started in IT effectively in 1978 with a TRS-80 Model 1. So, for all of you who are probably far younger than I am, that gives you an idea of where I started. Things in IT now are so specialized, it seems like. Everybody has their different area of, internet security, or they're a programmer, or a software engineer, or they're a data engineer, all these sorts of things. When I started, if you were in IT, you pretty much had to do all of it yourself. It was a one-man show. So I have a lot of background and I've touched a lot of different areas over the course of my career. And in 1989, at the age of 20, or 1987 rather, at the age of 21, I joined the Navy. I spent 20 years serving on U.S. nuclear submarines and spent time on both coasts in California and Virginia, and finally landed in Tennessee. So now I'm actually from Tennessee. I live around the Nashville area. And I've worked since the Navy in hospitality data. I've worked in manufacturing data, and now I'm in law firm data. I've been with Perkins Coie for about 2.5 years. My experience with Denodo when I worked in manufacturing landed me the job I have now, and I'm fully in charge of our data virtualization system, and have architected something that, our main goals are to democratize our data to end users, to remove friction when they want to access data, and to respond quickly to their needs and their demands. So let's see. So what I want to talk about today, though, is how we're using Presto. It's enhanced our performance of the ability to return information quickly. It's presented cost efficiencies to us. I want to talk a little bit about the scalability of the system, and then I'll wrap up with exactly kind of how we're using it and what our future plans are. So when Denodo started presenting Presto as part of their MPP product, Denodo MPP, we were very interested because we, at the same time, were starting to look at a data set called IntraHive. And what IntraHive does for us is it monitors the metadata on email between our attorneys and external clients, so that they can keep track of, how often people are meeting with clients, make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to, look for new opportunities, perhaps, and those kinds of things. But the data set is, over 100 million rows at the time, and this was back in 2023, so we've got another year worth on top of that already. We have one table that's all the activities. So that's like every email, every meeting, every, that's sent, received, scheduled, what have you. That table was 80 million rows, and then there's the activity participants. So for every activity, all the participants each have their own row. And so that table was at the time about 120 million rows. And we wanted, and in order to really do any meaningful analytics on that, you actually have to be able to combine participants with the activities and come back to an answer either in some sort of a grouping, or perhaps an attorney asks a question like, when was the last time I met with this client? And in order to find that, you have to be able to see not just the activity, but which ones was the attorney participating in, who else was participating in the activity. So there's a lot of different touch points with both of those tables. In SQL Server, that actually becomes problematic to execute that query. So what we did in our proof of concept, we set up an Azure Kubernetes cluster. Wow, I butchered that. An Azure Kubernetes cluster. And we used machine size of 32 CPU and 64 gigabytes of RAM. Now, if we'd have read the instructions properly, we would have actually gone with 32 CPU, 128 gigabytes of RAM, but we missed that part of the instructions, and so that's what we're stuck with until our commitment for 3 years runs out. So far, we haven't had any problems with it, but where we expect we might get into some situations, just sort of like what Bolt was talking about, we may run into some memory issues where we're trying to execute queries that have plenty of CPU, so they don't think it needs to scale, but we run out of memory to execute. So far, we've been okay, but ultimately, we'll see. We did this comparison against SQL Server, and we used a variety of different query types. We used, just plain select star, very simple stuff, smaller tables, larger tables. We worked with some groupings and joins, did some window functions, ran some inner queries and CTE type queries just to see how they worked, and some full text searches, which are terribly expensive, of course. But we wanted to give a good flavor of how Presto's performance would compare with our SQL Server infrastructure that we currently had. And so this graph represents all of that. But what I want to do is kind of look at it a little more independently. Basic workloads. These are like the select stars, very simple queries between things. It didn't matter the table size really. There was fairly similar performance between the two. Sometimes SQL won, sometimes Presto won. Always, except for the very last one, which was a large table joined to a large table. These results were all sub 1 second. So really, you're not, from a user perspective, they're not going to care, right? Where things got really interesting, though, was when we started doing these more complex workloads. So you can see on our test number 12, I don't know if you can read the small fine print, but it's the second to last one, Presto actually achieved a performance of 70 times what the SQL Server was running. Now, we were testing this as well, not just with a single load, but we actually ran the query 4 times simultaneously to see what would happen. And then the test that's like 30 times in the middle there, we actually did a test where we round robined like 5 of our other queries that we were testing and ran them 4 at a time, so we weren't running the same query 4 times over. We were actually running 4 different queries and then cycling through them. And in all these cases, Presto presented anywhere between 5 to 70 times better performance over what the SQL Server would accomplish. This encourages us to go ahead and pursue this technology, the Denodo MPP technology. And kudos to the folks at Denodo, because they've made it very easy for an end user to implement. Their script actually, all we had to do was build the Azure Kubernetes infrastructure on Azure for us, which is our platform of choice for cloud computing. And the Helm charts to deploy Presto and everything are all written by Denodo. They have scripts built that sets up all the connections between the Denodo platform over Java JDBC to Presto. And so everything just, once you run the script, it's pretty much set up, done, and available to use. There's very little configuration that we had to do. And it even has a lot of neat stuff about scaling, which we'll get into in a couple of slides. We were, really excited by how well this works now, especially. In 2023, when we started doing the proof of concept, we, of course, encountered a whole bunch of little hiccups and hurdles along the way because Denodo was just implementing this as well. And I think, that they probably learned some things from us and from our testing that helped them make their script even better. And so as a result, now people can grab this and, just go with it. And probably, I could probably, with what I know now and Denodo's revised scripts, if I came to your company and tried to set up a Presto cluster with Denodo, I could probably do it in 2 days at the most. and maybe even less. It just depends on mostly how quickly you can set up the Kubernetes cluster. So we weren't concerned then about performance capabilities, but we were looking at what else does this bring to the table. And one of the major things that Presto brings to the table, especially coupled with Denodo like we have, is cost savings. We were comparing it to a Microsoft SQL server that would be hundreds of thousands of dollars to run per year. It's not scalable in that you have to buy more SQL Server if you want to make it bigger. It's not as interoperable as, especially with Denodo stacked on top of Presto, as we can gain from that scenario. So we went with the Presto experience gave us a less expensive option. We're spending tens of thousands at most for our Kubernetes cluster. It's easy to scale it up and down. We're just using the CPU is how we would approach that, but currently we're just fixed at our 4 because we haven't even really scratched the surface on that. We're still gaining adoption and traction, and I'll talk about that in our last slide of how we're approaching that. And then, because of the Denodo layer on top of it, which we use for governance, we use it for security, and we use it for connectivity. And I'll show you in a couple slides as well on how we're connecting to all these different data sources within our company, and I'll talk about how exactly the Presto engine brings value to us with the data. So with scalability, I guess this is kind of an eye chart slide. I'm sorry about that. Didn't realize it because I was sitting right in front of my computer. But basically, you configure the Kubernetes cluster so it is set up for auto scaling. And then Denodo is graciously included in their embedded MPP configuration file specific lines of code where you can enable auto scaling. You can tell it the maximum number of workers it can have, and you can tell it at what percentage of CPU utilization it's supposed to start scaling up. Together, that makes it about as easy as you could make it. I mean, all I have to do is tell them, I'm at 4, but I want to be able to go up to 20. I put in 20, and if I start using my cluster too much, it'll start adding workers as needed until the CPU utilization of the cluster comes down. And then it'll track back down to the minimum allowed, whatever you've set that to. All right, so I'm going to spend probably the most time talking about this slide a little bit. I've got, as I said, I've got experience in both manufacturing and in hospitality, which could, at the time, Denodo wasn't an option in hospitality when I worked there, but in manufacturing and then in this law firm I'm working for. So in manufacturing, where I worked at A.O. Smith, they make water heaters. Everything was SAP. Our HR was SAP, our finance was SAP, our inventory was SAP, everything was SAP. We used Denodo when we acquired companies so that we could connect to their systems in place and make the data ready to put in SAP because everything was SAP. In a situation like that, Presto probably doesn't really bring anything to the table for SAP. They have their own internal way of doing things with their HANA system that's all in memory querying. I don't know, they do a bunch of different stuff. It's expensive. They could probably gain a lot of benefit from using something like Presto instead, but they won't. But that was that experience. Then I came to Perkins Coie, and Perkins Coie has a system for finance, a system for tracking dockets, a system for tracking matters, a system for tracking trademarks and patents, a system for, so you get the idea, system. And where Denodo and subsequently Presto brings this value to the table for us is it gives us a one-stop shop, this integrated hub that we can centrally govern and secure the data and give people access. So instead of sending somebody over to the SQL server to get personnel data, they just come to Denodo. And Denodo gets the personnel data directly from Workday, which is our HR system. There's no middleman. It's there. It brings it in. Denodo provides us the ability to cache the data if we want to. If the source system is fast enough to read directly from and not worry about caching it, we do that. Typically, we don't cache the data unless we have a need to. But we really like the ability to do that, because now, instead of a person having to have access to a SQL server here, a SQL server for finance, Workday REST API, some Intap REST API, and then trying to figure out how to download their information and make use of it in an Excel spreadsheet, which is what they're going to do with it. Let's be honest. They're going to build themselves an Excel spreadsheet with 5 different sources of data underneath and try to draw their own graphs. So we give them the ability to get all that information in one place. And, we gain the ability to centrally govern and secure that. We have one point where they're going for their data, so we don't have the security holes of having multiple access points for all our data. And in addition, it allows us to do some future proofing as well, because when you create the interfaces in Denodo the way we have, for example, our website backend changed recently. We went from a company called RubyLaw to another company called Pantheon. And all I had to do was connect to the new data source on its REST API, bring the data into Denodo, and repopulate the final interfaces that went out to all our users. Nobody using that data knew the difference at that point, because it was, we formatted it the same, we gave them the same pieces of information, and it made it a very seamless transition. I did all the work instead of like 10 different people having to do their own work because they were all connected directly. One of the things we're still working on getting around, we use Power BI. That's one of our biggest data consumers. Most of our Power BI is done by the gateway picking up data from Denodo and just storing it and using it in the reporting as an import. So we don't see a lot of traffic. I mean, we know the data we have is being used because the reports are being used, but we don't see the traffic directly to Denodo because Power BI has insulated that by bringing the data in an import mode and storing it itself. It makes it hard to determine exactly how much adoption we really have in our system. Interestingly enough, we're moving to the newer version of Fabric for our Power BI. So a lot of that may connect more directly to Denodo in the future and not have the intermediary of doing imports for everything. The way that Fabric seems like it works is sort of like what their direct query mode works, only better, because it figures out how to query the data based on the semantic layer model that you've built on your report, on your Power BI report, and then it'll write the query that it needs to get the information to display, and just send it out and get the information. And it seems like it's working really well so far. They've been testing it for the last couple months, and we're supposed to go live in January with that new model, and we'll see how that works out. So we've talked about how we're using it as an integrated hub and the advantages of that. Primarily, again, one-stop shop for people. And then lastly, we're doing Gen AI. So Denodo has just released an SDK for their product that provides you the means to write or use your own chatbot and basically use Denodo as a RAG model to generate a query and pull data. So now we have the ability to get data-based answers real time from our we have a custom in-house GPT-4 based chatbot that we've been developing. And it answers a lot of questions. And so now we're looking to expand its capability by actually having data-based answers. Largely the driver for that comes from, we have an in-house developed program that was back in 2021, 2022, and I forget the technology it's built on, but it's one of those where you have to specify, if they ask a question like this, then go get this answer, and it's very specific of what questions you can ask it. So it's not really, it simulates a natural language AI type program, but it's not really an AI program in and of itself. Because they were unable to secure the finance data behind that program, because what they were trying to use it for was attorneys could say, hey, where am I at with relation to my billings and my budget for this matter for some client? So they want to be able to find out, am I on pace? Am I spending too much money? Do I need to cut back? Do I have room available? All those kinds of questions that an attorney might want to know about their client and the financial status of it, they can ask this program. The problem is they couldn't secure the data behind it. So they don't want, Joe asking about Bob's clients. They don't want Bob asking about Joe's clients. So it's only trusted to like the top 50 partners, the most senior 50 partners in the firm have access to it. Even with this limited audience, that application over the past 2 years is the second highest usage web application we have in-house. So what we're looking to do between Denodo's ability to govern and secure data, Presto's ability to give rapid responses when you ask it a question of a large data set, and our in-house ChatGPT is to connect all those parts together. And now Bob can ask this engine, hey, where am I at with respect to financially on this matter, and he'll get an answer. But if Fred asks, hey, what's Bob doing with client so-and-so, it's just not going to give him an answer because that data is secured in Denodo. Fred doesn't have access to Bob's data. So we have the ability to secure it, govern it, ask questions of it in a natural language. And literally we've been testing it for the past 3 months now. And it does a really good job of figuring out the query end of it all by itself. And where it falls short is mostly because in order for a natural language model to understand and write a proper query, you have to have the fields, you have to have the metadata there. You have to have the fields properly described so that the ChatGPT can understand what do you mean by person number, or what do you mean by position title, or what have you. So we're in the process of fully describing all of our fields and all of our tables so that the large language model can properly identify what information is contained where. And then it does a really good job of figuring out what to ask. Sometimes it makes a few little mistakes. We're playing around with, like one use case we have, we want to be able to ask, who's the assistant for this attorney? And in addition to returning the assistant, we wanted to return details about them, like what their phone number is and how do I get hold of them, and not just what their name is. So by default, the large language model just says, oh, you asked me who the assistant is. The name is, Kristen Watson or whoever it happens to be, right? So in order to tell it no, we also want their phone number. How do I get hold of them? What's their phone number, their email, which building or office do they work in? And then we also have like generic group emails for a variety of different categories that go to a whole group and the next person picks it up off the pile type of thing. And in order to get it to properly answer the question of all the information we want, then we were able to provide the SDK some custom instructions that says, okay, in addition to the person's name, look in this table and get all their details, and look in this table for all the general group information that should also be included in this answer. And so with just that little bit of extra prompting to the LLM, it now answers the question completely and fully as what we would want it to do. So, we figure with 50 users being the second highest use on that application, when we go live with Denodo as the back end to answer, all the finance and all the personnel and all the kinds of questions, you might just want to ask in a natural language, and making it accessible to the entire firm, both lawyers and business professionals, we expect it's going to explode. And Presto, because Denodo also brings to the table and how it uses Presto as its MPP engine. If I ask it a question and there's data that's on the MPP or in the Presto side of things, and I've got another one, the table that's say in SQL Server, but it's small, Denodo is smart enough now with its optimization. It says, okay, if I move this table over to Presto, I can query the whole thing in Presto and it's going to rock, and it does. And it actually is, I think, I haven't actually measured it exactly, but I know we did it. We did a workshop example back at Denodo Fest in 2023, and it was about a 4 times improvement in speed. It went from like a second down to a quarter of a second because it would move the table and query it all in Presto instead of just doing it all in Denodo. So, you know, really exciting stuff. It's what we're excited about. Thank you for your time. I do appreciate it. And if anybody has some questions, I'm happy to try to field them.